So first and foremost, we want to shout out Daniel Gross because we consulted him early on about the need for this and who to invite and even the title idea. I think we bounced off each other. So really appreciate his partnership here as our campus writing and communication coordinator. And our panelists include Dean Tyrus Miller, Dr. Julio Torres, who should be on his way from Spanish, Dr. Ian Coller, is it? I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, but yeah, he's on Zoom here, and big appreciation to Ian for joining us from across the ocean. France, is it? Okay, it's that France to delay. Okay, thank you so much. It's not a convenient time for him, but he has made this work, so we really appreciate that. And Dr. Amalia Herrmann from Humanities Core and Dr. Jonathan Alexander. So I think we'll just get started. We have a pretty packed agenda. So Waverly, you want to take it from here?
Hi, so just to note also, we will be recording the session. You can see the fancy recording equipment in the back. We'll make this available to you all as it is available. Just really excited to be able to share this with the rest of campus, especially I know we got a lot of emails from people who are disappointed they couldn't make it. So just wanted to make sure you all knew that was available. So we have a few prepared questions before we have time at the end for some audience Q&A. And the first question here is just to kind of get us started. And there's a handheld mic here if you'd like to pass it around. Whoever wants to start first, you're welcome to. And Ian, if you want to start first, we can always go to Zoom first too. But what is your approach to incorporating or moderating AI use in your course? Please share a specific example that illustrates your approach if you have one ready. And is there anybody who'd like to start? Yeah, Ian, do you feel comfortable starting?
Sure, I can go ahead. Yeah. Um, so thanks so much for inviting me. This is great. I'm sorry that I can't be there in person, but I'll be back soon. So I would just start by saying I have a fundamentally agnostic approach to AI. I don't, I don't think we can ignore how easy it can be to use this technology to circumvent much of the effort in a class, but I don't feel that the answer is to panic and go back to in-class blue book tests unless there's some really good argument for that. I feel like we have to ask why students want to use AI. And I don't think the answer is just because they want to save time and they want to cheat. I mean, I do think it's a bit more complex than that. And one of the things that I guess I've thought about is the balance between content and skills. Uh, Historians love content. I love content. But a lot of the content that students learn will be lost within days of the test that they took on that content. I mean, I remember it from when I was at college. It's always the same. So for them, I do think that a lot of them feel like, what is the loss in getting AI to do that work since they're going to lose it anyway? In contrast, I think that skills are permanent if they really gain those skills. So explaining those skills really carefully and designing the syllabus around them is crucial, which is one of the reasons I'm so horrified by people using AI to actually generate syllabi. That is not something I support. Um, but there's a lot of talk when I was taking my kind of pedagogy training, there was a lot of talk about Bloom's hierarchy, this pyramid thing, building from knowledge as the foundation and ending with evaluation and these kind of higher level skills at the top. And some of my colleagues have really criticized that, and I would agree with them that it's actually round the wrong way for us. And we would really want to start with developing the skills of evaluation and then analysis and comprehension, and finally begin to build the knowledge base rather than the other way around. So that's just to kind of give you a sense of my approach in my world history class, which is the example I want to talk about today. So it's world history, revolutions and empires from 1650 to 1870. So students panic at the beginning. Wow, all this content they're going to have to learn, right? Um, but I explained right from the beginning that this class is focused on teaching them how to ask questions about the past. It's not about dates, about names, and places and so on. Um, so we investigate things that a lot of people assume are just givens about the past, like, for example, the Industrial Revolution. Um, and we ask questions like, was it a revolution that took 200 years? Or was it instead an evolution? Did it start with industrial production in Britain, as it is so often imagined to have done? Or was it really something coming from industrious activity spread across the world in small workshops in places like India and China, as well as here in Europe? And, around here in Saint-Étienne in France is a really good example. Um, One problem with that, however, is that students don't necessarily have that conventional version of the Industrial Revolution, and maybe they never even heard of the Industrial Revolution. So they just assume that what I am teaching them is just the correct version of history. And so that's where ChatGPT comes in and is really helpful for me. I feed in the questions like what was the Industrial Revolution into the chatbot, and out comes a perfect iteration of all the cliches and conventional assumptions about the Industrial Revolution. And for their midterm, the students have to critique one of these answers, and there are multiple questions that they're dealing with, but they have to critique it based on what we learned in our and what we discussed in class. Um, so it's pretty hard for them to use ChatGPT to do that. I'm not saying it's impossible, but it's not easy. They would have to feed in a lot of the materials from the class into the chatbot. And even if they do that, by going through that process, they will have at least understood and kind of gained the skill that is kind of underlying here, which is recognizing that there's not one single and fixed understanding of the past, but there are kind of multiple and competing ways of understanding our collective experience. So, and I guess I just finished by saying that, quite a lot of the students kind of surprised me in their evaluations by saying that the midterm was, I quote, fun. So that is a pretty surprising and pleasing outcome, I think, from the use of this. And it kind of, I think it put their minds to rest about, well, it gave them a sense of the limitations of ChatGPT, but then it was also something really useful for them.
Okay, well, my particular use of it practically is a very maybe particular use case, which was why I think IT was interested in collaborating with me. And that was for a graduate course in visual studies, so essentially a kind of art history graduate course. And what I went into the exercise with was basically a couple of, let's say, working hypotheses. One was that there was, as is typical in a graduate course, quite a bit of reading and quite a bit of information to manage. So I really wanted to think about this not as a sort of tool that, let's say the chatbot would help you frame questions for a session discussion or, help to review for a midterm, which I think are all potentially perfectly good uses of it. But I wanted to see the extent to which trained on a body of art historical literature and utilizing the specific literature for the course, how it would do in terms of a kind of advanced knowledge management, probably in the range of 3,000 to 4,000 pages of reading and images and so forth. And then the other was basically as graduate students that they would also likely already or soon have instructional roles and how they would think about their experience with this in the graduate seminar as potentially informing their practice in the classroom. And I think the first use of it was for some reasons that were technical, just in terms of how I would have managed the input into this better, to get better, kind of answers and results out of that. But I think also some things that were inherent to the way that LLMs work, that was a very middling result. It wasn't that great at, kind of creating meaningful summaries. And this was partially a product of the probabilistic way of that LLMs work. They went for the most obvious things. So there were instances where sort of the outline and the summary that it would produce were kind of like, well, thank you, but we already have a table of contents, or we already have chapter headings, that more or less tell you what the LLM also kicked out. So we very quickly got into a space where we were exploring more the use of it less as an answer machine and more interested when it gave less likely results that actually helped to frame questions that then sent students back in pretty analog ways to the materials, but actually, thinking about them in different ways. And I think actually that's when you're asking about an approach to the course, that's potentially an approach, is actually, and I think Ian's example of his midterm is a little bit, along these lines, that rather than looking at to being answers, it's actually a means by which you're asking either more surprising or more interesting or more nuanced kinds of questions about the material. And I think that's a very promising direction, actually, to explore. In terms of some of the sorts of uses where they just tested it out in terms of, I'm thinking about framing some questions for a session discussion or, potentially assignments for an essay. I think that they saw that as potentially having more value. But again, I think, again, thinking about the probabilistic mode, it's going to come up with a set of essay questions that are the most obvious thing to ask about Virginia Woolf's To the Lighthouse. And you ask them those obvious questions that ChatGPT generated for you, and they're going to put it back into ChatGPT and give you the most obvious answers. And there's a sort of vicious circle there. So I think actually, again, using that to disrupt the more cliched ways of thinking, the most likely ways of thinking, it's good at that, of coming up with those very probable kinds of connections. And somehow circumventing that or sabotaging it or using it to disable some of those cliches, I think it's a promising approach.
Thank you. And thanks again, Waverly and Danny. I wanted to really appreciate the fact that we're here in a room together. Ian, by virtue of technology, we at least get to see his face and hear his voice. And it reminds us that having these opportunities to be in person, learning is a social process. And that's one thing that I'm going to continue to emphasize in terms of teaching, that learning is a social process. We cannot be disembodied, isolated individuals, that our knowledge building is situated and relational. So of course, as a humanities teacher, I'm going to want to reframe the question a little bit, as even our colleague, Dr. Torres, who's not here, all of us in some way in the humanities work with language, and we work on language. So as we've heard before, these notions of not taking AI as something to be necessarily used, that instrumental approach, but something to be studied, to be taken as an object, I think is something that's really interesting and something that we can definitely contribute in the field of humanities. I also probably want to reframe the question in terms of AI use. We study language and what it does and the choice of words. So as part of my own self-education about the technology and the pedagogical affordances, I want to be really careful with the words I choose. We study how words can persuade, can harm, can create beauty, can shape understandings of the past and politics. And so I avoid saying AI or the AI or an AI. I think what we're all assumed to be talking about are generative AI powered chatbots or other interfaces that are powered by LLMs, as Dean Miller mentioned. In my experience, students are a little more interested in ethical questions about image generation, which is a useful way to talk about the replication of biases in images because it's very visual. But I think we're all talking about generative AI chatbots. And so in that regard, I was able to reduce our approaches to generative AI chatbots in my course to 4. And hopefully I can give those rather quickly and then give a particular example. Our emphasis in Humanities Core is considering where our students are. They are first-year students, a significant proportion are first-gen, a significant proportion are low income. They're at a transitional moment from high school to university, and there are foundational skills that we need to help them develop. It's an introduction to the humanities, as well as a writing intensive course. And considering who they are and where they are plays a large part in our motivation through critical pedagogy and a pedagogy of care, considering we're getting a little chat back and forth. So I've been trying to inform myself so that I can use accurate words, so that I can help my students understand. Hi, Julio. And so that I can exchange ideas with colleagues. So in Humanities Core, we've taken a flexible, responsive, multi-pronged approach to how we're helping students understand what they need to learn, what the processes are, so that they can make choices about what they want to do. We do not engage in a police-like surveillance of our students. We don't find that works well. So 4 of the things that we've done, all centering on clear communication with our students who are learning to be college students. 1, in addition to carefully written program policies that emphasize writing as process, assessment rubrics. These help students understand what the expectations are for the written assignments, and we make sure that we don't reward superficiality, those cliches or those assumptions about history that get articulated in these generated sentences. 2, talking together in class, explicitly, directly, repeatedly, about the differences between examples of generated text and the kinds of writing that scholars and students can do. This helps avoid a lot of misunderstandings and helps students understand that what we as teachers in the humanities are looking for in the writing are not the superficial generalities that are produced. They come in with some understandings that this is what college level writing looks like. And so we need to do a lot of work repeatedly, over and over, every quarter, making sure that as we do that, we're tying the examples to specific learning tasks in the course, whether that's summarization or compiling an annotated bibliography. 3, we've moved more towards more in-class writing. That does take time, but it's worth it. More in-class writing where students can have their attention on the task. A lot of the students understand that when they're outside of class, they find it hard to focus, to attend. So having that time to write and not be judged on their writing, it has worked well. In addition, in-class reading, collective reading. I've practiced a lot in my class having students as groups collectively annotate the reading. Slowly, closely, you can use Google Docs to do so. 4, strategically using written and oral feedback. First of all, I need to demonstrate as a teacher to my students that I read or listen to, if they're producing audiovisual material, every word that they produce. Some students don't think I will do that, but I do take the time. We might be, as teachers, the closest reader any of these students will experience. Our students are from majors from across the university. I point out the inadequacies of sentences that look like they are synthetic, not in an accusing way, but helping students understand why those are inadequate. And most importantly, I point out with sincere interest where they have useful ideas. And this is something that, through a very patient process of repetition, does work with students who are coming in with misunderstandings or inadequate understandings of what's expected of them in college level reading and writing. So for an example, I had a student who in spring quarter was working on his capstone research paper, and in the small, low stakes preparatory assignments was turning in sentences that looked synthetic. They were really boring, generic, banal, cliched. And I kept responding to his homework that these were really boring, generic, banal, cliched, over and over. And I knew I needed to do that patiently, until finally, as he was working on the drafts, he had an original idea. And that is what I seized on to communicate in the written feedback and then in the in-person feedback. This idea you had, that's really interesting. Could you tell me a little more about that? And then,
just a second.
And then write it down. In Humanities Core, we offer in-person conferences. Every student meets with their instructor frequently. It is normal for us to have 10 hours of office hours in a week. That's not unusual. And it is worth it. It is not replaceable. It is that human relationship that I can then reinforce in the classroom. So in the day when we have students reading and discussing each other's work, I can ask the other student, what idea in his essay draft did you find most interesting? And of course, he points out the most original one. So then the student looks pretty pleased at himself that he had the confidence of that idea. So those are some of the examples of what we're doing, what's possible in small in-person classes, where we can develop that kind of human relationship and give the students a sense that it's actually worth it to develop your idea because I care about it. I will read it, others in the class will read it, and we're interested. That student turned in a paper that was not an A paper, but it was good, and it was his own.
Thanks, Amalia. I really appreciate how you were talking about the human dimension of the pedagogical. And sometimes I will hear students talk about the friendliness of the ChatGPT voice, and it's pleasant. And I think that definitely speaks to an ongoing need that we have to be able to connect, and how wonderful to make opportunities for people to connect generatively in class. So I want to approach this question with 3 quick anecdotes. And I'm going to start first with the idea of what does it mean to be a humanist? Since this is the Humanities State-of-the-Art around GenAI, and my thinking around what it means to be a humanist got a massive jolt nearly 20 years ago when I was sitting in a forum in the Department of Informatics and talking with an anthropologist who was doing ethnographic work in World of Warcraft, which is a big computer game back in the day. I think it's still around. And one that I had been playing as well. And she was an incredibly gifted ethnographer, brilliant anthropologist, and doing a lot of work around what were the kinds of normative play that people were engaged in this world of Warcraft. And so when she finished her remarks, I asked her some questions about, it's like, well, that's all really interesting, but I've also seen people get married in World of Warcraft. That is, they use that space in order to hold wedding ceremonies, and some others will use that space to have a race, to see if they can race from one end of that world to the other. It has nothing to do with playing the game. And she said, well, that's, those are anomalies. Those aren't, they're quirky. They might be interesting, but that's anomalous to the actual use of the game, to the playing of the game, to what the vast majority of people actually do in the game. And in that way, I realized, I'm a humanist, because I'm interested in the weird and the quirky and the queer and the sort of one-offs, the things that people actually do to generate other ways of knowing or being. and that there absolutely are, and are necessarily so, whole realms of knowledge production in our world on our campus that are about big probabilities, right? About the normative, about finding out how do things usually work. We would not be able to survive as a species or a culture if we did not have that kind of thinking. But just as important are the kinds of epistemologies that give us the slant, that give us the otherwise, that give us different or ulterior or alternative ways of thinking. And I think that that is not the only work of the humanities, but it is a crucial part of what the humanities offer our culture epistemologically. That leads me to think about generative AI and what it does, and the fact that, as Tyrus and Ian were talking about, there are definitely ways in which generative AI, given its probabilistic methods, provides us with some good generalized sense of things, albeit banal and cliche, as Amalia puts it. Or, as I've been having some wonderful discussions with folks on campus, and my colleague Daniel Gross knows quite a bit about this, there are ways in which generative AI could be very useful in the sciences and in STEM fields for crunching very, very large amounts of data. But I'm reminded that, as with Tyrus's example, that may not necessarily for the humanities be the most interesting way in which we can think about the use of generative AI. And as Tyrus was saying, it's the quirkier bits, the odd bits that actually might be interesting. So, second story, I decided to experiment with this just this past week. I was asked by our dean to introduce the Velic Lecturer. This is a major lecture series that occurs every year in the School of Humanities. And this year we have Mackenzie Wark, who is a phenomenal media scholar and who does a lot of work with the digital media, digital technologies, very interested in AI, not just generative AI, but AI writ large. And I thought, well, wouldn't it be quirky to have my ChatGPT chatbot generate a introduction to her, and then I riff on that in some way? I thought it would be clever. All it really did was pull from her various websites, all of which I could see. So it wasn't that interesting. So I said, well, let's make this even more interesting. I said, that's great, but do it again and make it weird. For which the chatbot sort of substituted a lot of strange adverbs. And it was weird, but not useful. Egoist that I am, I said, all right, well, you could do that for Mackenzie. Do it for me. Give me a bio. And it pulled from my various websites and did the same thing. And then I said, now make it weird. I'm apparently very weird, except that it completely misunderstood. Misunderstood? Is that even the word? It got one of my books totally wrong. So even though I could see that it was pulling from different sites, it completely botched one of my publications, one of my major publications, and just got it totally wrong. And that, again, reminded me that even now, no matter how much time has passed with these tools, we have to be extraordinarily careful that they do get things wrong, however pleasantly or weirdly we ask them to communicate that knowledge to us. This leads me to my third story, and one that actually I'm very indebted to Professor Wark for reminding us about, which is that when I go to talk with students about generative AI, I'm not just interested in talking to them about those instances in which generative AI gets things wrong, or how generative AI is thinking or is working in probabilistic modes that may not necessarily get at the most interesting humanistic kinds of questions. Instead, I have to admit, what I'm most compelled to talk with students about is the fact that they are engaging in a very particular kind of technology for which they only see a very particular surface. What they're not seeing when they ask generative AI to produce text for them is everything that goes on beneath that surface. That there are entire structures, material structures that exist, which are not only incredibly resource damaging, that actually pull from an extraordinary number of very finite planetary resources. But that also, every time we use these particular platforms, we are giving it content. We are giving it writing. We are almost inevitably participating in the training of models. And there's a way in which, while we seem to get something from it, often botched, middling, banal, we are in the process providing a huge amount of labor to corporations, to other stakeholders, pretty much free of charge, in helping them train their machines, which continue to extract vast amounts of resources from the planet. So in fact, what we become ourselves is another extractable resource of knowledge for these machines, for these companies, corporations. I think it's important that our students understand that. As a literacy studies scholar, this is not new to me. It may be new around GenAI, but it's not new to me that the mode of communication, the mode of writerly or textual engagement is absolutely crucial, and that we have to understand the particular affordances and limitations of any modality of composing or communication that we use. And so to me, any collegiate level understanding or use of ChatGPT or any other kind of generative AI platform that does not begin with a thorough interrogation with students of how these platforms generate what they do, who benefits from that generation, and what the cost of that generation actually is. If our pedagogies don't do that, I think they're irresponsible, and they're not paying enough attention and giving enough responsibility and agency to our students to know how and when and why to use these platforms. So.
Thank you. Julio, I'm glad you're able to join us. Do you want to talk about your approach to incorporating or moderating AI use in your course?
Yes, absolutely. I first want to apologize because I am on campus, but apparently I overbooked myself today. And for some reason, I wanted the meeting to be next door in the Anteater Learning Pavilion and not where you are. And I realized it wasn't there when I was walking to the building. Anyway, so I decided to connect through Zoom to not be tragically late to the meeting. So I apologize for not being in person. I would have liked to be there in person. So I will share how we're using generative AI I'm the academic coordinator for our Spanish 3H, which is a heritage writing course. And this course is for heritage speakers, for students who grew up speaking Spanish at home, but who've had very little education, right? Formal education with Spanish, and they need a lot of support with their writing in Spanish. And most of these students are going to either do a major or one of our minors in the department. So the course serves as a bridge to our upper division courses. So students, part of this course, there are two main goals. One is what I like to call, we offer linguistic therapy, right? Because a lot of the students come to us with a lot of insecurities, linguistic insecurities, trauma on the use of their language or their lack of, right? Depending what messages they get about their Spanish in their local communities, and even from their families. So that's part of the course. And then the second part is to work on their writing skills, right? So for a smooth transition into our upper division courses. So last year we started playing around with ChatGPT, and I developed a classroom-based study to see how our heritage students were using ChatGPT, what I'm calling in the wild. So I'm a little odd in this group because I always say I'm a social scientist in the School of Humanities. So as a social scientist, so I rely on data. So what we did was we collected, not to say humanists don't, but for us, data is very, it's a priority. So what I did was collect data during the quarter last year with one of our graduate students who taught the course. And so based on the findings that we got from that study, which actually we're writing up the manuscript as we speak to publish, send for publication, we developed, this year we're piloting PapyrusAI, which is It was developed by the Digital Learning Lab in the School of Education by our colleague Mark Warshire, who's the PI of the lab. And they basically have created this platform, right? Papyrus is a platform for using AI for writing development and also generative AI literacy. So what we did is this quarter and last quarter, we've been piloting prompts. So we developed prompts. There were a few prompts that the lab provided to us, right? What they've been using. And then what we did is take those prompts and adapt them for the Spanish 3H course. So, and also based on the data we got. So something that we've been playing around, and I'm gonna look at this during the summer, is how one of the things that came out of the data, the results from last year's study, was that students stopped using ChatGPT by the end of the quarter. So we're comparing their first essay that they wrote in the quarter, beginning of the quarter, to the last essay they wrote at the end of the quarter. And they're basically saying that they stopped using it because it was not their voice. They felt that basically what they're telling us, and this is me interpreting what they're telling us, is that the language register that ChatGPT used was not compatible or did not align to their register, right? So they felt that, even though it was giving them some feedback on their writing, it wasn't their voice. So, and which was kind of surprising to us, right? There was some type of effective response to the use of generative AI, which we were not expecting, right? We expected things like writing conventions, language issues, but there were some effective responses that the students had with using ChatGPT. So based on these things, that's one concrete example from our data set. We are training Papyrus AI using prompts to see how it really tries to align, we assigned it a role, a heritage writing coach, right? In order to really take into account student Spanish variation and the variety of Spanish that they speak, having grown up in the United States, right? Speaking English and Spanish all their lives. So that's one way that we're using it. And the idea then is to see, can we reach a middle ground? So on the one end, right, I think there is a potential use of ChatGPT modeling language, right, for the students, especially writing, right, which these students need, but also so that it's not so disconnected, right, or really far removed from the students' variety of Spanish. So I would say that we're using it for three reasons. One, so students are getting corrective feedback on their essays, which it's not anything groundbreaking, right? We all know, right? People are using it for that. And I want to say that ChatGPT in the well did a pretty decent job. Now with Papyrus AI, we have trained it on how to give feedback. The second area is students are also using Papyrus AI as a brainstorming coach. So how to develop a thesis statement. We were very clear, Papyrus is not allowed to give them answers. But in looking at some of the data, I actually presented some data at a conference last week. I was at Northwestern University. Looking at some of the data, right, it's really interesting how it really prompts them and gets them to think without giving answers, right, to the students. Again, it all has to do with the prompt. And then this third area is about the register. And I'm a linguist, so I'm very interested in this. And looking at something we call linguistic alignment. And linguistic alignment is basically how students will adapt their use of language based on the conversation and the interactions that they're having with Papyrus AI. So I'm interested to see whether or not that affects the way they're writing, their interaction, how they're reading those cues, right, in the register that Papyrus AI is giving them. So I will leave it there, right? So those are some of the ways that we are using generative AI in our heritage writing course.
Yeah, thank you, Julio, and thank you all for your answers so far. I know this topic is so huge and we could talk forever about this. We do want to make sure we save 10 minutes at the end of this for audience questions. So we have a couple more prepared questions, and we wanted to just ask if each of you would take maybe 1 to 2 minutes just to make sure we have that time at the end. Pick whichever question speaks the most to you, which one you're most excited about. So the first question is, what do you think is the potential role, if any, of AI in students' writing development? Or as AI becomes more and more ubiquitous, what do you think is the role of the teacher in the learning process and classroom? So pick whichever question you'd like, just 1 to 2 minutes, and then we can make sure to save some time for audience questions at the end. Ian, do you feel comfortable going first, or do you want someone else to go first?
No, that's fine. Yeah, I mean, I do teach I do teach a writing class, but I haven't really taught it since since the advent of ChatGPT. So I'll leave that for others to discuss. But what I would say in relation to the second question, just that I guess the kind of core of my answer would just be that, AI should make us better. It doesn't, I mean, there is no, I mean, it would be just utterly horrendous to replace the human interaction. Amalia's already made this point, right? Education is about human interaction. But that doesn't mean that we can't be better, that we can't actually refine and sharpen what it is that we do. And particularly as humanists, I do think that AI actually points up the absolutely crucial and central importance of the humanities. It is much more difficult to replace we do and what we teach, because it is very much about critical thinking, about thinking differently, and thinking creatively. So every time I've been challenged, I think by AI, by really confronting the kind of shock of what AI can actually generate in response to some of my assignments. It My response and what I've actually learned from that has made those assignments better, and it's sharpened and made clearer to the students what are the skills that we're actually gaining from this. So, I mean, that's kind of my optimism. I think we have reason to be pessimistic in some ways about the kind of general attack on critical education as a whole that's coming from many quarters at the moment. And I think we have to be very careful about resisting that. But I don't think it's AI that is doing that. I think that's politics. So we need to be able to kind of differentiate between those two things.
Yeah, I'll also take the second question. And I agree with all of what Ian said. I I I don't see I don't see AI as that it would be either desirable or even really possible, let's say, under the scenario in which we keep the integrity of the university as an institution, to think about substitution. I do think that there are creative possibilities and ways in which AI can assist us, and also perhaps challenge us in various ways. And I think one of them is that it actually highlights the extent to which much of what we do has a certain kind of quality of being generic. And that's not a bad thing, but it does mean that when we really want to define what the human contribution is, where we have a technology that's very good at producing the generic, we are challenged to rethink certain things. And I would say that there's a logic by which we tend to think of technologies, and I think we have to actually get out of this particular logic, that either it's a tool, which means basically it's just subordinate to our intentions. And I think AI, in this sense, does have the potential to exceed that idea of something that we can just apply as a tool. And I also don't think it's a substitute. I don't think it should be, and I don't think it does the things that we can do. But there is a sort of almost, there's a Derridian concept of the supplement, which is both that there's an insufficiency that it fills, and also an exceeding that takes place. And it's a different logic than either the tool or the substitute. And I think beginning to think about what its difference is from us, and how we can put those differences to use for something that's greater than just the sum of the parts, or that, it could just be subordinated or substitute.
Thank you. I might be a little more Foucauldian than Derridian in this response, but I wanted to echo Ian and the optimistic emphasis on opportunities to think about our pedagogical principles and rethink our methods, given the students who are actually arriving in our classroom and this polluted information ecosystem as well as damaged environment in which they're growing up, and thinking about not just the technology that exists, but the people who design it, because these are questions of power. So I'm going to combine these two questions on potential role of AI in students' writing development and ubiquity of AI in the role of the teacher, maybe. I think the role of AI in students' writing development is like that of any other technology. It is social and cultural. And so taking this as an opportunity to help students understand their role as critical thinkers in a world, not just in the classroom, going back to what Ian said also about persistent skills and that kind of flexibility of being able to read closely, write carefully, and think critically as they go out into the world. The question about the ubiquity of AI reminds me of what Jonathan said earlier, that this is not actually new in terms of a technological phenomenon that it coordinates with communication. A colleague in ICS, Paul Dorish, wrote really insightfully about ubiquitous computing in an earlier era. And we've seen, some of us are old enough to remember that MOOCs were going to change all of education. And so thinking about these relations of power, who holds the power, who's marketing the technology, and how we can help students become not just users of a particular software, but careful readers, writers, and thinkers. I'm still stuck on a comment earlier this week in an interview by the CEO of Duolingo, which has fired their linguistically skilled contract workers because they don't need human beings anymore. And he believes that AI can teach better than teachers, although he thinks teachers will still exist and schools will still exist, he says, because people will still need childcare. So this idea of educators as babysitters, along with, on the other extreme, as Ian was saying, these political attacks on knowledge experts, on professional expertise, and on the institution of higher education, I think these are ways in which we all need to resist corporate efforts to redefine the role of teachers.
Thank you, Amalia. Very quickly, I would just reiterate in response to the second question, I think if we are using any kind of platform like this, we have to teach students how they actually function, how they work, who benefits from their use, and what kinds of limitations are inherent within them, and what kind of damages are wrought from their use. Look, we don't pass out paper syllabi much anymore, right? Because we are aware of the resource implications of passing out paper. We need the exact same mindset when it comes to ChatGPT and other platforms. Very quickly, two things. ChatGPT, generative AI, these are not only tools. They're businesses, they're corporations, which have extreme implications for resource extraction on this planet and for the furtherance of information ecologies that Amalia at least thinks are toxic. And we know they are toxic. Our information ecologies don't work right now. And we need to have a strong sense of how these tools contribute to that and further that information toxicity. Secondly, I love everything that Ian was saying. I would just say that I cannot think of politics and these technologies as separate anymore, given the extraordinary political influence that tech bros, I think they're called, currently have in our culture. And that we absolutely, I think as humanists or as social scientists or just as citizens need to think very critically about the rise in these technologies and the collateral rise of a certain kind of infotechnocracy that is maybe not necessarily very comfortable with democracy. So I'll just leave it at that.
Julio, do you want to share?
Sure, thank you. I would just say a couple comments. I mean, I think I'm just going to reiterate what's been said because I agree wholeheartedly with what my colleagues have shared. So I will say something real quick, obviously, because I did talk about writing development. So, you know, when we look at, I guess I look at technology for me as neutral and it's how we use it, right? I think it's very important to Jonathan's point of who's behind creating these, the businesses. I think those are all very valid and critical questions to consider. But as a writing development for the second question, I yes will say that our data show that students are noticing gaps in their writing, noticing how they need to improve their writing based on the feedback that ChatGPT gave them. And I will say again, without any training. So again, when we're talking about writing development, are there maybe some benefits there? Absolutely, right? Because what we're seeing is that students are developing metacognitive awareness, right, of their writing skills, and that's something we want to encourage. However, to the second question, I think is very important. I mean, and again, I'm going to echo what has been said, that the role of the teacher is very important. It's super important, right? For all the reasons that were stated here. And in part of the course, we have a whole day on a generative AI workshop, right? So we spend at the beginning of the quarter, we want students to be very critical about the use. There are a lot of issues with these models, especially for non-English languages. And I've used the models myself to create even experimental items where I find that there are issues. So very important that we, help students really understand those dynamics, being critical, how they can leverage, right? The use of generative AI, again, because we see some potential benefits with regards to writing development specifically. But also how do they evaluate the output, right? So as teachers, I think, right, the way I see my role as an instructor, as a teacher in the classroom, is how we continue to updating our knowledge because it's changing really fast, and the technology. So, one of the challenges, how do we keep up with the technology, and what are the changes, right, with these models? And furthermore, something also I've been thinking about, and I think this was also mentioned, is how do we reconceptualize what we do in the classroom? And that's something I've been thinking, because it's with us. And how do we reconceptualize how we do assignments, how we do tasks? And I've been engaging with colleagues actually at this conference when I presented some of the data that we have. Sort of what are the soft skills sometimes that we probably need to teach our students, right? And what are things that, she has activities, for example, a colleague where she puts them really to collaborate with one another, assigning them roles, right? So I think, we need to understand what is it that generative AI will be able to do, right? And how do we get students, and this is where the humanities part is very critical, right? What is it that our students need to be able to do, right? And in addition to being critical, and be able to evaluate and understand the use of generative AI. So that's where I am. I don't have answers, but it's something that I've been thinking about, how to reconceptualize what are we doing in the classroom, and at least in my case, in the language classroom. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much. If we can give a round of applause for our panel here. I'm so happy we've done this because in the course of just these really 2 or 3 questions, as a non-humanities, a non-formally trained humanist, my mind was on fire. I was starting to sweat. I got chills. Like, there's such a unique, valuable perspective that we're getting from you all, and I hope that this encourages us for more of these interdisciplinary conversations, because I think we're hearing and thinking about ways in a really important way. And one thing I want to share, in case you didn't already, so we are getting close to 3 o'clock, and so you will be excused if you got to go. No problem for both our panelists and our audience, but we've decided to hang around another 15 minutes for anyone who can stay, so that we could at least address a few questions, which I'm sure we have several of, but really no pressure for everyone we all have very busy schedules. One thing I just wanted to share for the faculty here, in case you didn't already know, DTI, our office, has been doing a listening tour the past couple of quarters, going to department meetings and learning more about the challenges that we're confronting with our teaching, and also suggestions for more support from DTI. And something we heard in some of the humanities departments was the need for more humanities-specific conversations around generative AI. And so this event is partially in response to that, and partially because we knew we just had so much to learn from this panel. Anyway, just a reminder that we are open to doing that. We've just did one today in nursing, and we have a lot of data. We visited around 20 departments, and we're analyzing that, and we'll respond later with more support that's more aligned with what our faculty and graduate students need. So with that, if people need to go, that is okay. But if you're able to stay, you're welcome for the next, we'll go until 3:15 and jump into our Q&A portion. So please raise your hand if you have a question, and we'll go around and address those. And I'll pass the microphone around. And you're welcome to direct your question to a particular panelist or just for anyone on the panel.
Thank you. Thank you so much for being here and share your experience in using GenAI. I just have a quick question about what's your recommendation for students that's already very dependent on using AI to write, but still wanted to improve in their own writing? Thank you.
I can say a little bit because I've had this situation, as I said, working with first-year students. I am not interested in blaming them or surveilling them. I want to understand the context from which they're coming as human beings who have a past, life outside the classroom. You use the word dependent, and I have encountered students who believe they are dependent. Whether they started using these tools because a high school teacher told them to, or because they thought everyone else was, or because they thought my focus has to be on the grade and this is the best way to achieve that. I would reiterate that that's part of the reason we need to think about our assessment practices, what could drive them to have that kind of focus, and also then things I mentioned. Giving students confidence in their own ideas, giving them low stakes practice on writing without distraction, even in class, and giving them the opportunity to communicate orally with other students in dialogue. And above all, as teachers, having patience, because I think some of the students believe that no one is going to listen to them, that they won't be able to do it. And so if I can be there week after week, encouraging them, listening and finding when they have that spark of an idea and encouraging them, I think that is the way to do it. And it is a slow process, but I think it is worth it, especially if we can interact with those students in their first year.
I'll add something real quick. So it's interesting, this question, because in our data, we found the opposite. So students, and we don't know if this is an effect of the workshop that we do with them, right? So we take a whole day to go over what is generative AI. We want them to be critical of the output so what we found is that a lot of, again, in the study, by the end of the quarter, a lot of them did not even want to use it anymore, which was very interesting. And I don't know if that's because of that workshop that we did, we scared them or something, right? Or really did a good job in the workshop, the graduate students. So it'll be interesting to follow up on that with using PapyrusAI. But yeah, I think, we need to explore that more, because obviously also a lot of our students did not have any experience with it, but I think that's going to change obviously with newer generations. So I think part of it is thinking of the assignments we give. That's why I've been thinking, how do we reconceptualize assignments? And at least in this area of writing, how do we reconceptualize it in a way that right, that students don't become dependent, right? Or just having, the generative AI do the work for them. So yeah, so it's a good question, and it's a lot of thinking. But again, from our perspective, our data, I was really surprised that students said, no, this is not for me. Yeah, because this is not my voice. This is not how I would. So yeah.
Do you want to add?
I was just going to say, Julio, I found just really interesting what you said about voice and the student's sense of their voice. And I think, one of the motivations for, say, using in a sort of substitutive way is that they don't have the feeling in writing that they have that voice, that they recognize themselves in writing. And I think that's That's one of the tasks we want to get them to. And I think anybody who has a writer-early voice experiences the alienation of, you put something in ChatGPT, and one response is like, oh, this is pretty good. But the other is that alienation and that sense like, this isn't me, and I'm not going to read this speech or, whatever it might be.
This isn't so much a question as a follow-up comment. I used to teach language, and I also used to teach composition. I'm a librarian now. I know a lot of people in this room. But anyway, I feel like underlying that question about dependence on generative AI for writing is kind of, for a lot of students, especially multilingual students, they kind of think if you're writing in L2 or L3 or L4, right, that frictionless writing is good writing. And there's kind of we have to first start to unpack that, of like, what do we believe is good writing and why would we be dependent on this to produce something that we think of as good writing? And I think for many of us who write, or teach writing, like frictionless writing is boring writing. It's that friction. I think this is what Jonathan, what you were saying, is like, that's the interesting part. Those are where the ideas come from. This is what creates a voice to begin with. And I think that it's to be able to read a lot, I think is also really important, right? So if students are relying on generative AI to summarize also, and they're not reading a variety of voices, they don't develop that ear for voice. And so then it's very difficult for themselves to produce different kinds of voice and develop sensitivity for their own voice also, as well.
Thank you. Did you want to comment on that?
Oh, I would just say we actually, as Amalia well knows and Tamara, our writing director, knows, we actually shifted a big part of our rubric for writing assessment this past year to voice, to thinking about voice. And we did it expressly to make a contradistinction between voice and correctness. So a lot of the language that we originally had around correctness is now substituted with voice. And I do think sometimes, look, we've seen it. I sat with students, and Tamara has sat with students who will put their writing through one of these programs in order to kind of clean it up. And in the process, we see some of their own really interesting thinking, the friction of their thinking stripped away. But these students have been taught, you produce clean, grammatically correct writing. That's what you have to produce for people. That's often how students get here to begin with. So part of what we're doing, in some ways, is trying to create a pedagogical space where they can enjoy some friction, where they can enjoy a little messiness, where they can actually think through, hopefully in some really generative ways, their own ideas, without necessarily, and find some of that own voice, without necessarily feeling that they're going to be penalized because it's not correct. I'm really curious to learn more about Julio's experiments. One of the things that is so interesting is that when we survey students about their use of GenAI, a good chunk of them say that they worry that they're not going to be learning something if they use it too much. And I think that actually corroborates kind of what Julio is discovering as well in some of his work. So our students are aware.
Maybe you could all elaborate a little bit more on what voice looks like, it sounds like, and what the pedagogy is around that, because it's partially, our fault as educators over time, and this is the student experience. They get rewarded and punished for correctness or being kind of mid, as opposed to bad, right? And they're like, I just want to not be bad, right? But that is not our current pedagogical environment. We are looking for other things, but it's going to be a slow process, and we need help. And I think that's where one of the places the humanities can be really helpful, is because we actually have been working on this, not as well and as much as we could have and should have, but now is our chance, right? I think this is a related question or observation. The sort of humanities orientation toward normative discourse and normative thinking is helpfully, I don't know, contrarian in some ways, right? There's a way in which part of the methodology might be take the norm, whether it's historical or GenAI produced, and think differently, right? That can be a kind of methodological move or a kind of an intellectual move to make. We wouldn't want it to come off as I'm thinking in physical terms, like an allergy to the norm or a disgust with the norm, because that's not the point, right? The point is it's the method, it's the thinking. So what are some ways then, I guess this is a kind of related second question, to teach that we're not disappointed or disgusted with the norm, but we want to think about how norms are produced, what's our relationship. An example comes to mind, the Bootstraps version of the American Dream. It's not that, it's what are you doing with it? And this gets back to the person in the room, right, the student. It's not good or bad, it's what are you going to do with it and where are you with respect to it? So some thoughts I would love to hear from the panel.
Let me say something just in relation to just this whole conversation. I guess one of the things that I've found with responding to AI is that it's often not, I haven't experienced it as kind of panicking and trying to find a solution so much. And I've kind of heard this from some of my colleagues here. It's actually clarified some shifts that I've already been making in my own thinking about pedagogy. And so just, as a kind of as an example in terms of those issues around voice, for example, I would say, and I'm thinking more about it as a result of this discussion, but for graduate students, for example, one of the things that I've started to do is no longer grading their work as we go through the quarter, especially when I was teaching the research seminar, just leaving them to develop their voice and just responding, just giving them feedback, but without attaching a grade to it, as I was always kind of taught, everything had to be graded, so that students can know where they are in the class. But I've just found it to be, it's so much better when the students are just developing, and that's what allows them to develop their voice, is to give them that space by taking that kind of sword of the grade away. And when it comes to, the other thing I would just point out when it's relation to undergraduate students is just that I do sometimes feel with some of my colleagues that they have such a negative attitude about the use of AI and of accusing students of having used ChatGPT or other tools, that, it's not actually trying to engage them as to why they're doing that, or treating it the way that I was taught to deal with plagiarism in my early pedagogy training, as a failed stage of learning rather than as a deliberate attempt to cheat. You don't just assume that that's what the students are doing, right? The students they may be using ChatGPT because they just don't trust not only how they write it, but how they think. And we've had students in that situation in class who couldn't do anything without opening ChatGPT. Other students told us about it. But I think, we need to engage those students and talk to them, as some of my colleagues here have clearly been doing, talking to them in depth about, what is ChatGPT and what is it doing, because the results can otherwise, I think, be very dangerous. But we need to not take this kind of punitive and very negative and accusatory approach. And I think that's something that we need to kind of encourage our colleagues to be developing.
All right. Well, thank you all so much. Let's give another round of applause for our panel. Thank you for all of you for sticking around a little longer. We talked about student perspectives on GenAI. One thing I wanted to just share with you all is that you may have seen in the last week or two a survey come out from DTI. There was about faculty perspectives, staff, and student perspectives. Different emails went out to everybody. We've collected a couple hundred responses already, and so over the summer we'll have a better sense of the campus perspectives from different sorts on GenAI. And there's so much more we can do here. Just as a heads up, on September 18th, before we start the new year, will be our next UCI Teach Day that DTI will host. We'll have many more conversations about GenAI. I expect that we'll have results from the survey I just mentioned. We invite education researchers, such as the types we have on this panel here, and Waverly and other research groups doing this good stuff. So you'll get a save the date soon, but September 18th will be a lot more good conversations. Thank you all. Final task is please take as much food as you can so that we don't waste those sorts of resources. And yeah, we'll see you next time. Thanks.